Hi, I'm here with Barbara Forrest, and we're going to be talking about the Dover trial from 15 years ago. Barbara Forrest is a retired professor of philosophy in Louisiana, which she calls the ground zero of the textbook wars with creationism. And she wrote a book called Creationism's, can you hold it up there?
Sure.
Creationism's Trojan Horse, the Wedge of Intelligent Design, which is why our graphic has a Trojan horse there.
Yeah.
And she was also one of the witnesses at the Dover trial. And so that was 15 years ago. And we're just talking to several people associated with the trial over the last couple months. And so we're really glad to get Barbara here to talk about this. And can you tell everyone a little bit more about yourself and who you are and how you got sucked up into this crazy story?
Well, until 3 years ago, I was a philosophy teacher. I retired as a professor of philosophy at Southeastern Louisiana University. I'm a native Louisianan, born and raised right here, never left home. And I raised my family here. And the way I got involved was in 1981, my first involvement, 1981, Louisiana, the state of Louisiana passed a piece of legislation called the Balanced Treatment Act. That's a short name for a long title. It was a law that required teachers in public schools to teach creationism, creation science, anytime they taught evolution. It was a requirement. It was mandated.
When was that?
1981.
Okay, yeah.
And I was a beginning part-time philosophy teacher at Southeastern and was asked to participate on a panel to discuss that law. And that was my first formal entry into this issue, was that presentation. And I didn't do anything on it again. I was busy working on a PhD, having babies, raising babies.
Well, you were just a grad student then.
I was in grad school working on my PhD, right. And so I didn't have any more involvement until about 1994, when creationists came into my parish, my county, where my children were in school, and tried to get a creationist curriculum guide inserted into the public schools. And that was where I first heard about intelligent design, because they were using that term then. And so I got involved then as a parent, trying to keep that creationist curriculum guide out of my children's schools. That was in 1994. And I received assistance from the National Center for Science Education, which is a very well-known organization.
Yeah, we had Ken Miller and Eugenie Scott last month to talk with us.
Director, yeah. So I got assistance from them and succeeded in keeping the Creationist Guide out of our public schools. Now, that took several years.
Why was that important to you? Are you just anti-religion and anti-faith? What's going on? Why was that important?
I'm certainly not anti-religion. I'm against having non-scientific religious views taught to my children and anybody's children in a science class. And this Creationist Guide was really bad. It was incompetent. Even as creationism goes, it was incompetently done. And so I was interested from the standpoint of protecting my children's education and science, and also keeping other people's religion out of the public schools where children are a captive audience. And so I approached it as a parent from that standpoint. And after that effort wound down, it took about 3 years, 2 or 3 years, I had started following intelligent design, because someone at the National Center for Science Education told me that this would be the place to watch. The Discovery Institute had set up a place called the Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture. That was the headquarters of the intelligent design movement. So I just started watching and started writing an article, and that article eventually grew into my book. It became the focal point of my scholarship, my professional scholarship. Started as a citizen activist and ended up being the focal point of my professional scholarship.
Wow, that's kind of surprising. You probably didn't expect that would happen, right?
I didn't set out for that to happen, but I was given the background I had in my philosophical training, I was pretty well set up to do that. I had written my dissertation about a philosopher by the name of Sidney Hook, who was the most prominent disciple of John Dewey. He was one of the 20th century New York intellectuals, and it was the group he was in. He was a follower of Dewey. And both Hooke and Dewey had written a great deal about public education and the importance of science and the importance of democracy to public education and the importance of democracy to science. And Sidney Hooke was a pragmatic naturalist, which meant that he accepted a worldview that was grounded in scientific fact. And so I was pretty well prepared to approach this issue in the way that I ended up writing about it.
So let's talk more about that. So you ended up as one of the witnesses in the Dover trial because your book had already come out, right? So you were one of the few people who had actually written like a book engaging the ID movement, or did the book come out afterwards?
No, the book came out the same year. What was interesting is I'd like to point out that the first book-length analysis of intelligent design was written by my friend and colleague, Robert Pennock.
Yeah.
The Tower of Babel. And I think that was the name of it. And anyway, he wrote the first book-length analysis of it. But the article that I had started writing after my effort as a parent here in Louisiana wound down became a book-length manuscript because I was researching how the Discovery Institute was executing what they called their wedge strategy. And so I had a book-length manuscript, and somehow or another it made its way to the eyes of an editor at Oxford University Press, which was interested in it. And they wanted me to expand it by adding a scientist as a co-author to do a bit more scientific critique. So Paul R. Gross became my wonderful co-author. Paul is a very distinguished scientist. And we wrote the book, which came out in January 2004, the hardback edition. We wrote that book with the aim of explaining intelligent design from every conceivable aspect, both scientific, religious, political. I mean, we went at it every way we could. And we wrote the book knowing that at some point there would be a legal case, which is why we were so careful to document it extensively and analyze intelligent design.
How did you know there was going to be a legal case?
Oh, we knew that the Discovery Institute was searching around for one. They wanted a legal case. They wanted one that would be someplace favorable to them. So we knew that there would eventually be one.
And to be clear, I don't think that the Dover trial was actually the case they wanted. I think.
No. In fact, I was getting ready to explain that.
Yeah.
They wanted a legal case, but they wanted one they could control. And everybody got surprised when this case came out of a little area like Dover. It sort of came out of the blue. Nobody expected it to come from someplace like a small township in Pennsylvania, but that's where it came from. So we knew that there would eventually be a case. Nobody knew when or where it would happen. It just turned out that before when our book came out in January 2004, before the end of that year, there was a court case in the works. And so Paul and I were glad that we had gotten the book out when we did and had written it the way we did, because that book became an important part of the lawyer's preparation for the case.
So let's talk about this a little bit more. So your basic case, if I have it right, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, is that that idea is basically creationism. It's a religious view, a sectarian religious view, so it shouldn't be taught in schools.
That's right.
So the howls that you get from ID proponents, and I want you to break this down. And I'm not actually even sure if I entirely agree with that. To say it's merely that, isn't it possible in principle that ID could be non-religious, or are you saying more from a sociological point of view?
No, it's two leading scholars, Philip Johnson and William Dembski, both defined it in religious terms.
Well, yeah. So Philip Johnson does, and you're talking about like in Darwin on Trial.
Yeah. Intelligent design is the logos of John's gospel restated in the idiom of information theory. That's how William Dembski defined it. So what they did was to substitute for the book of Genesis. They substituted the book of John, the logos of John's gospel. So in their own words, it is undergirded by religion. It is the logos of John's gospel restated in the idiom of information theory. So that's not my opinion. Those are their own words. So
but let me push back constructively on that. Let's take evolution. I mean, I affirm evolution. I think it's how God created us. I think it's his providentially guided process I should say a providentially governed process by which God created all the diversity of biology we see. Now, that's not a statement against evolutionary science. I mean, my evolutionary science is just like any other scientist, but I just described it in religious terms outside of science. Does that mean when I talk about evolution, it's therefore a religious concept now?
No, because when you say that evolution is a providentially guided process, you are
governed, yeah.
Yeah, you are essentially giving a religious explanation to a natural process. The natural process is the process of evolution, which is, the basis of evolutionary theory.
So let me work through this then. So then, if I'm allowed to make
the providential part is the religious part, which is not part of the scientific process.
Yeah. So there's a point where the way how I see evolution then has a scientific component, but I understand it in a religious way, and I can talk about that, and that doesn't somehow undermine the scientific points I'm making.
That's right.
So why isn't ID allowed to do that too, where they make a scientific point? Now, I disagree with many of these scientific points. I'm not even arguing for ID, but why are they not allowed to then make a scientific point and then describe it outside of science in a religious way? Like, why is that not allowed? If we're allowed to do that with evolution, why not with ID?
One of the term for what you are proposing is called theistic evolution, and that's a religious viewpoint. The intelligent design people have been very vociferously opposed to theistic evolution. And of course, anybody's allowed to, if they have religious viewpoints, to try to reconcile the science that they would like to accept with their own particular religious gloss or interpretation of it. What they can't do is try to get it accepted into public schools.
Yeah, so we're not trying to actually teach. We're not trying to teach providentially guided evolution within public schools,
right?
But at the same token, they weren't trying to teach the John, the First John 1:1 interpretation of or the intelligent designer being God within schools either. So I'm still a little bit trying to figure out, and maybe I just don't. Maybe it's really clear, and I'm just not smart enough to get it, or I'm missing something really critical. I don't understand yet, though, how you make the jump between they described it with a religious gloss elsewhere. That means, therefore, when it's talked about in science in secular terms, then it's definitely religious. Like, can't it possibly be? I mean, just hypothetically speaking, maybe it wasn't the case in this scenario. There's a scientific component and then there's a religious component, but they're only trying to get the scientific side in science. I don't know. Does that make sense?
They had no scientific side to present. That the science was done. The science of evolution is settled science. The Discovery Institute had nothing new or original to offer in terms of science.
Well, that's a different issue. Yeah, I think so.
Everything they had written in the early days of their effort, when they were trying to get donors, trying to get support, trying to get funding, was clearly religious. And once they got that off the ground, okay, their part of their effort, as laid out in the Wedge strategy, was to get intelligent design inserted into the public school curriculum. The minute you call it intelligent design, you have introduced a religious element into what is essentially a natural process. And they made a very studied and concerted effort after the Dover trial to change their language. Intelligent design is a clearly religious or supernatural term. The minute you start talking about natural processes as intelligently designed, you have introduced a supernatural element into that explanation. Now, that's fine if that's what you want to do from a personal standpoint, but you cannot take that into a science class. And what they wanted to do was to get into the science classes. They have very clearly stated that. They wrote there was a book that was published about how to get intelligent design into public schools.
That's the Darwin on Trial, or a different one?
No, that was a different one. That one was one that was a fairly obscure little book. And the gentleman's name escapes me at the moment, but they had somebody at Gonzaga up in Washington State who wrote that book, and I'm sorry, I can't think of his name at the minute, but they had somebody who they published that book, and it was about how to get intelligent design into public schools. And so this is how they promoted what they were doing until Dover. But even by the time the Dover case came up, they knew that the term intelligent design was a liability because it had been exposed in the scholarship of many people, scientists and philosophers. It was fully understood. Intelligent design was fully understood and documented using the words of the Discovery Institute people themselves, that this was essentially at bottom a religious effort, seeking to promote a religious point of view. That the Discovery Institute knew that, which is why they tried to get the school board in Dover to either reword the policy, which used the term intelligent design explicitly. They tried to get the school board to either drop the policy or rewrite it because they already knew that that was a legal liability because of the underlying religious components of intelligent design. They failed to get the board to do that.
So why do you think they haven't dropped intelligent design as a term then?
Well, let me just go a little bit farther and finish out the story.
Sure, sorry.
And so what happened after the Dover trial, they began to alter their strategy by adopting code language. For example, they couldn't promote quote unquote intelligent design anymore because that had been thoroughly shredded in court in the Dover trial. They had to promote something under using code language as a disguise. So their new front became academic freedom.
And teach the controversy.
Right. Teach, and even those were not new. Those were all recognized by scholars as earlier creationist language that had a history. But they had to avoid the term intelligent design. As Judge Jones recognized in his ruling, intelligent design could not escape from its creationist underpinnings. And so they adopted a linguistic strategy to try to promote intelligent design under the guise of something else, teaching the controversy, arguments against evolution, evidence against evolution, critical thinking. That became a big one. In fact, that was the one they used here in Louisiana. And so, but the history, there is a direct line between this language and not only the Discovery Institute, but earlier creationists going all the way back to the young Earth creationists who use exactly the same type of language. So if you know the history of what the Discovery Institute has done, you can see the line of descent, no pun intended, very clearly, between earlier creationism and intelligent design, and then the sanitized language that they presently use. In fact, Nick Matsky, a scientist who now lives in New Zealand, but who was working for the National Center for Science Education at the time during the trial, did a very, very careful and detailed study of how the language evolved from creationist, overt creationist language to the sanitized language that the Discovery Institute had to start using after the Dover trial. So there's no question about the creationist underpinnings of intelligent design, and there's no question about the strategy that they had to adopt after the Dover trial. It's very clear once you look at the line of descent.
Yeah, I think. Look, I mean, we don't have to belabor the point. I just think that. Well, there was a question, but I do think that there's a weakness in trying to dismiss it merely by its origins, because there can, in principle, I mean, look, I have major criticisms of ID. I think there's many different ways where I think it fails ultimately, and I don't think it should be in the public school system. But I do think that there are stronger arguments than others against it. And it's also possible you're thinking about it primarily from a cultural or a legal point of view, because maybe some of the reasons where I think there is an issue maybe makes it fail in science, but isn't as strong of an issue in the legal point of view. But I think there are religious movements where you could imagine them putting forward a purely scientific idea. Now, I don't think that they've succeeded in doing that. But the bigger question now that's kind of on my mind is you're talking about how they realize that there's a legal liability for intelligent design and that it was just basically pegged as a problem. So why do you think the Discovery Institute hasn't moved on from intelligent design? Everything they have is about intelligent design still for the last 15 years. So maybe not in the legal or the policy side, but in terms of what their actual branding is and what they do, they're still the ID movement, right?
Okay, I would just like to say one thing left over from the previous discussion. I'm not dismissing intelligent design on the basis of its origins. I'm dismissing it because its origins reveal what it is, in terms of its substance. So I don't want to be accused of dismissing something because of its origins. The origins reveal some important things about what this movement really is. Now, your other question is why they haven't moved on is because they don't have anything. They have produced no original science, so they don't have anything scientific to offer. I mean, they set up right before the Dover trial, they very hurriedly set up something called the Biologic Institute, which was a laboratory in Washington, somewhere near Seattle. And that was their, by the way, this is what creationists always do. They set up research institutes. So they weren't any different from the young earthers in that respect, but they set up the Biologic Institute, which it simply has produced absolutely nothing, and it is now 15 years old. So they haven't moved on because they don't have anything with which to move on. They don't do any original science. What they do is simply to rehash their scholarship in different publications and different formats, but they can't move on because they don't have anything new. They're doing the same thing now that they were doing 25 years ago.
Yeah, I think the situation is a little more complex. It's funny. I've been watching ID for a long time too. Maybe from a different vantage point. I was an undergrad in '96, and when I first learned about ID a little bit, like when I was in high school, just before '96, and then I actually met Michael Behe in 1998, and for a long time, I was actually really convinced by it. It was really in my graduate school, in my PhD, I did an MD PhD, and it was really in the middle of my graduate school, I think it really started to clarify this really just isn't even good science. I mean, a lot of the stuff isn't factually there. I think the part where I agree with you, I think the big themes that they have just not changed at all. On a smaller level, like a more fine-grained analysis, there has been some new things that they put forward, and some of it has been interesting at a time, but at some times, but it really has never gotten. I don't think they've really gotten out of like the big names like Dembski, Behe, Myers, and maybe Doug Axe as well too. That's really what seems to be driving what they're doing more than anything else, and it really is the same arguments with slightly different variations, right?
Yeah, you can look at their website and see that they really don't have anything new. If they were interested in really interested in science, they would be doing mainstream science, working with in the circles of mainstream scientists. That's never what they've done.
Well, okay, so I do want to push back there. So they're ID 3.0, and so I've actually looked into this a little bit. Now, I don't think it does what they think it does, to be clear. Once again, I'm not an ID advocate. I'm a critic of them. They, for example, have funded really good and interesting scientific work in James Tour's lab at Rice University, making nanodrills to actually bore into the cancer cells and do drug delivery. Now, the thing is, I don't know what that has to do with ID per se, except for.
Are you saying the Discovery Institute funded James Tour's work?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
and also several other people. There's actually several mainstream scientific studies that they've actually been funding lately, and I don't know how any of them really connect to design. To be clear, I mean, I know how they explain it, but it seems like some pretty large jumps in logic. But they are actually going and doing scientific work, some stuff that's actually getting published in good journals, but it's not really related to design in any sort of direct way.
All right. Well, I think
they weren't doing that.
That's very interesting, because what they have typically done.
But that's new. To be clear, that's new. That they weren't doing that 15 years ago.
Okay. So and I think what will be interesting to see is what they do with the work that you say they're funding. How are they going to interpret that work, and how are the people who are doing the work going to respond to the way the Discovery Institute interprets it, because what they have traditionally done is to take work that they haven't done, the work of mainstream scientists, and try to reinterpret it, right? And in some cases, distort it as supporting intelligent design. Okay, now that may be what they have in mind here. If they're funding legitimate, straightforward scientific work. As far as I understand, Professor Tour is not a biologist. Is that right?
No, he's a chemist, and
Right.
ID isn't just about biology. And I know that origin of life is not biological evolution.
Right.
Maybe you can call it chemical evolution, but it's kind of its own thing, where there's a lot more uncertainty. That's kind of more where he's really been focused, right?
Well, that's going to be very interesting, because I think James Tour has been connected with them for quite a long period of time now, and as a chemist, he may be doing some very fine work. The question is, why are they funding his work, and what do they have in mind to do with it, and what is he going to what is he going to say about the way they interpret his work? If they take the work that they have funded and use it to promote the religious idea of intelligent design, then they'll be simply doing the same thing they've been doing now for 25 years. And that is taking what is in many cases legitimate scientific work and reinterpreting it and using it for their own purposes.
Well, I think that's kind of what's happening. So I think the argument that I heard, I think it was Stephen Meyer give on a video, was that basically contrasting, and Doug Axe too, they were contrasting the idea of doing like high throughput screening based approaches to discovery versus like designed approaches. Well, and so saying, well, the designed approach there, and you can only really make progress with the design based approach, which I mean this is starting to get close to my area, because I do a lot of science and drug development, but which just seems like the most tenuous connection I can imagine to ID. That doesn't really.
Well, I mean, if the work that scientists are doing in their laboratories, legitimate science, and the legitimate science that Professor Tour is no doubt doing, has really nothing to do with intelligent design. Science is a naturalistic process. Scientists work with naturalistic processes. They develop naturalistic explanations. There is no other way they can do science. And so it would be really funny if, having funded this science that Professor Tour is doing, that they are sort of, pushed to move away from intelligent design and present it as, mainstream science, and stop. I would be more surprised if they didn't try to use it to promote intelligent design.
Oh, they are. I kind of gave you the logic and explaining how I am really struggling to.
So it would be really funny if they end up having to promote just what is purely naturalistic science, involving naturalistic processes, because that's exactly what they have argued against that since their inception. That they see science as they see naturalism as the enemy. They see the necessary naturalistic procedure of science as the enemy, and this is what they have. This has been a constant theme throughout the history of the intelligent design movement, is arguing against the naturalism of science. And the only other alternative is to interpret science as basically a supernatural process, which simply doesn't work. So, it's very interesting to hear.
Well, there's more than just that, right? So I think what they're arguing against, which I would say, when it's true, I should say, rather than if it is or how it is, when it's true, I think it is a problem. If you take science as really with only natural causes as the whole story, or really just science is the whole story, I think that there are a lot of problems that arise. I mean, we can't give an account of a lot of things that are really important. I mean, you can't even really give a good account of basic morality from a purely scientific point of view. I mean, you have to at least go into philosophy to start thinking about things like that. And if science is naturalistic and we're limited only to a scientific understanding of reality, that's going to create problems. Now, I don't think that's what science limits us to. Well, certainly certain public proponents of science have kind of gone down that path. There's really nothing in science that limits you to science only. I think the more natural way to understand it is science is a really legitimate way of understanding a part of reality, but there's more to reality than just science. Would you agree with that, or?
Oh, sure. And I haven't said anything that indicates that I don't agree with that. But the minute you start, if you're trying to explain the way the natural world works, then you are limited to the natural procedures of science. There's nothing else works. The minute you step outside that, you enter the cultural context of science and the social and political context of science. But if we're talking about trying to explain the natural world, okay, science is necessarily procedurally limited to naturalistic processes and naturalistic methodology, because nothing else works in science. Now, so from the standpoint of understanding the world, explaining how nature works, how biological organisms function, how chemical processes take place, science must confine itself to naturalistic procedures and naturalistic explanations. I have no quarrel with, people that are trying to fit that into a larger understanding of reality, which includes religion, okay? But you cannot bring those supernatural elements of one's understanding into the scientific process, because it just doesn't work. You don't get anywhere. So I think it's kind of a straw man to say that somebody who promotes science as a naturalistic process is trying to eliminate those other things as important. Nobody is saying that they're not.
Well, some people are, to be clear. Some
people are. I'm not.
I mean, let's be clear. Some people are, and a lot of very visible, vocal people.
Yeah, I mean,
are. So that's not fair. Though I don't think that is how the majority of practicing scientists really see it. I think if you're really engaged with practicing, I'll also say it's not just some of the visible people. I'd say the majority of practicing scientists would agree with what we're saying here. But I've observed a lot of people who aren't as directly engaged with the day-to-day of science, but are okay, I sometimes call them science groupies, but that's maybe not the kindest way to describe it. A lot of them do kind of take that view too, of kind of like this science only understanding the world. And so that really is a thing out there. And I think it is a big mistake to think that that's how most scientists see science. It's a big mistake to think.
That's a very unsophisticated way to look at it, to think that, the people that you're talking about, and I don't know very many people who take that point of view. Scientists, I don't think you'll find many scientists who say that questions of morality can all be answered by science. Although science can help us a lot, you see. Science has given us the only way of understanding the world that has proven to be successful in terms of enriching human life, curing diseases. I mean,
so I would push back. You think it's really the only way of understanding the world that has enriched life? And
no. It's the only way of understanding the natural world that has been successful at explaining the natural world. Okay, so the modern scientific process, relying on naturalistic methodology to understand the world, is the only thing that has worked. Now,
was Aristotle was what he was doing, was that science? Or what do you mean by science? Like, so if you go back to Aristotle and to the Greek philosophers that figured out quite a bit of that fundamental stuff, I'm just curious, in your rubric, is that science too, or is that something different?
Aristotle is doing some things that presaged modern science. He went to the island of Lesbos and he studied and he dissected and he cataloged natural organisms for about a year, okay, trying to figure out how they worked. But the minute Aristotle started talking about, a design outside that, the first cause, okay, that was metaphysical talk. Aristotle believed that there was a first cause that was the explanation for everything else that existed, or the way things function, right?
Yeah.
So Aristotle was combining what we would now recognize as naturalistic methodology with metaphysical explanation. Okay. Mm-hmm. And science is limited to naturalistic explanations for natural processes using a naturalistic methodology. That's the limitation that science has.
Yeah, I'm probably just splitting hairs there. What I agree with you. The way I just phrase it is that science has just proven to be the most effective way of understanding natural processes in the natural world. And that's what its purpose is. It's to help us understand it.
And it's the only thing that we have that enables us to understand the natural world. Now, science cannot answer moral questions. That's not what science is about, although it can help us a great deal. And I think there's
good information sometimes, I think.
Yes, for example, we know from a moral standpoint that racism is wrong, right? We know that because it is an inhumane way of looking at other people that results in cruelty. That's a moral perspective, right? But what helps us to support that is the fact that we know that there is no evolutionary basis for racial discrimination. Darwin himself helped us to see that. There is one human species, right? There's one left. We have one left. And when we recognize that based on Darwin's own work, there's only one human species and that the superficial differences don't alter that fact, then we have a powerful piece of information for arguing against racism. So science can give us great support at constructing moral arguments. It cannot by itself alone resolve moral questions. For that, you have to bring in other things from outside science.
Yeah, I think also too, if there is a supernatural that is interacting in the world, I think that science would probably misunderstand that, because just by definition, it wouldn't. I mean, that's a counterfactual from your point of view, because I don't think you think that anything supernatural exists. But if there was something supernatural that did something, and we encountered evidence of that, I just don't think we would scientifically be able to identify it as supernatural. We would identify it as something else, either an anomaly or some sort of natural entity, right? Or do you disagree with that?
That's right. I don't know. I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to identify something that you could see and hear and touch and measure as supernatural, and that's what scientists do. I remember being at
there's an interesting question that came in the chat that I do want to put up. It's relevant to this. And you're a philosopher, so it's pretty general, so you're probably familiar with philosophy of the mind. And I think this is an interesting question that I think does underlie some of this. The question is intelligence part of the natural world? You can put it another way: is the mind part of the natural world or not? So one argument that's being made, actually, which I don't endorse, to be clear, but just to put it out there, is that all intelligence, including human intelligence, is effectively supernatural. It's something that goes beyond what just natural things can do on their own. It's something that's supernatural. If that were true, I don't know how you would ever show that scientifically. And I'm not even really sure what that means to say it's supernatural versus natural. But the question is, is intelligence natural or not? Or is it supernatural? How would you even go about thinking about answering that question?
Well, we have a lot of evidence to show that it is.
Well, how is that so?
We have brains and nervous systems, and intelligence is rooted in the brain. And
well, the idea is that maybe it's connected to the brain. I don't think anyone's denying that it's connected to the brain, but the idea is, well, to have a unified sense of consciousness, maybe there needs to be something that's not only the brain. You can't reduce it to the brain.
What I see absolutely no evidence that it's anything supernatural. What would you use as evidence for that? And I see a lot.
I don't know what you use as evidence, but I don't know how to use evidence against it. So you can make the same argument either way, I guess.
When you have drugs, mind-altering substances, that can affect the mind, can affect the state of consciousness, that's pretty good evidence that intelligence and consciousness are rooted in the physical organism. When you have,
sure, I agree with that, but that doesn't still doesn't establish that it's only the brain. I mean, maybe it's something connected to the brain. Once again, I'm not arguing for this. I'm rather pointing out that as a scientist, I don't know how to adjudicate between those claims. I don't know evidence. You're saying there's no evidence for it. I don't see any evidence against it either. So I'm kind of at a loss as a scientist how to make an evidential, empirical path forward on that.
You don't have to look for evidence that intelligence is something beyond the natural world. That's not your job. You don't have to adjudicate it. I think it's incumbent upon people who see intelligence as something other than the manifestation of natural processes, it's incumbent upon them to present evidence. And so far, I don't think anybody's ever done that. I mean, you can certainly, you can overlay a gloss, on natural processes. You can interpret it. You can, if it is your preferred view to think of intelligence as so important that there must be something supernatural involved, that's fine, but it's an interpretation. It's not an explanation. And until somebody comes up with some evidence, and if you have evidence, what is that evidence going to be? If it's anything that we can measure, it is naturalistic evidence. It is not evidence for the supernatural. I remember, I keep thinking about a meeting I was at some years ago, in which there were people in the room who were arguing that there has to be a supernatural, that there has to be more than just natural processes. And one particular gentleman said, suppose you got to the moon and you saw some type of monolith or structure there that no human had ever seen or produced, and that had a message on it, that no human had ever seen and could not have produced. How could you interpret that as anything other than supernatural? The answer is you don't. You don't interpret it as supernatural. If you see a structure on the moon that no earthly human had ever seen and no one on earth could have produced, the only thing that tells you is that there's somebody else in the universe. There's somebody else in the natural realm that put it there. It doesn't say anything about a physical structure is not evidence of the supernatural. It is evidence that somebody else was there that we don't know about. So I think
but I think you're making, in some ways, you're actually echoing their case. They're arguing that we can look at things. Once again, I disagree with this argument, but possibly in different points than you do. But their argument, their analogy is that, if you saw that monolith, that you would be recognizing design, that something was there beyond natural process or beyond known natural processes there, that some mind was involved in some way. Now, you don't know who that mind is. And they would actually say, fine, we don't care. You don't even have to say it's God. Just agree with us that when you look at this monolith, that someone somewhere, a mind was involved in creating it. And
that's not the same thing as the supernatural, though.
Yeah, they would agree with you. That's not the supernatural.
Not the same thing.
You agree that flagellum is designed. And so that's not a religious statement. And it seems like that. I mean, I don't think that this is how it works, to be clear, but I think that's the point that they're trying to make. I mean, in principle, that does give them a way to separate the religious side from design. Like I said, I have a different attack on that. I think that it fails for a lot of reasons beyond just merely supernatural thing. Because I think you're right. I think science in the end doesn't actually then decide to see if it's supernatural or not to decide what to do with things. I would say it's probably more empirically driven rather than it's looking for natural causes in a very empirical sort of way.
I think when the people at the Discovery Institute say that they're not trying to introduce, that intelligent design is not a supernatural interpretation, I think that they're being very disingenuous, because their own writings indicate that this is exactly how they regard it. Yeah. When they are in public, of course, they cannot admit that. It depends on what their audience is. But they have always seen the intelligent designer as a supernatural. There we go.
Yeah, we lost % there. Yeah, you're right. I think they do.
We are trying to engage in a discussion about constructing philosophical arguments, and if you want to construct a philosophical argument that there's more to intelligence than just the natural organism, you're free to do that. But until you get some evidence that it is anything other than that, you really don't have very much. And what we're really talking about here is an organized movement, an organized effort to promote, which is well established, using their own words as evidence, which was formulated in order to get a religious idea into public schools. And the disingenuousness of their arguments when they claim that that's not what they have been trying to do, because we know that it is. And this is not a matter of dispute. It was litigated in federal court 15 years ago.
I think you're right on that. I mean, I think that was clearly what a lot of leaders had intentions for. I mean, it does become complex when you talk about large movements, because because not every individual within the movement maybe had that motive, but clearly that was one of the organizing, motivating ideas. Okay, so let's talk about the Dover trial a little bit more. What's some of your most interesting and memorable moments from that?
Oh my goodness.
You put some you gave some one to the NSCE website.
The NCSE, yes. Oh my goodness, I can't distill it down to one. I had to offer one moment that was memorable from the trial, and it had to do with the plaintiffs, because this case was really about 11 parents and people in Dover who were parents and teachers who stepped forward and became plaintiffs. 11 plaintiffs from a small area like Dover. It's just unbelievable that there were 11 people who were willing to do this. So that was memorable. But what was, I think that the most memorable thing is crystallized in what I gave to the National Center for Science Education. The fact that you had 11 people in Dover who thought they were fighting this all by themselves. And for a while they were. You had Barry Callahan, you had Brian and Christy Ream, you have just multiple other people. I can't name all of them here, but they thought they were in this little isolated area fighting this battle without any help. And they had no idea that all over the country, scholars, scientists, philosophers had been writing about intelligent design, had been following it, and that there had just been a recent book published about intelligent design. And I'm talking about Paul's and my book that came out in January of that year, 2004. They had no idea that they were going to get the kind of help they got. And so I think the fact that there were expert witnesses who had been doing this work for such a long time that they were ready to step in and help the plaintiffs succeed and convince the judge about what was really going on. I think that has to be the most important point, because these people were very brave to do what they did in a little town. And I know from having talked to some of them that some of their neighbors were not very kind to them when they stepped up in this effort. They were very badly treated at times by some of their fellow townspeople. And so I think that the main thing that I would like to emphasize is that the reason I was doing the kind of work I was doing was precisely for something like this. I've never wanted to be an ivory tower intellectual. I wanted to do some kind of philosophical work that would actually help people who needed help and do something to help preserve the separation of church and state, help preserve the integrity of public school science education. And that was my opportunity to do it. And all of that work I had been doing for so many years in my office and at home at night and on the weekends and on holidays I was able to put to use and help those people. So that, and they are wonderful people. The plaintiffs in that case were just wonderful, concerned parents and teachers and citizens. And a bunch of academics and scientists were able to help them. I think that's the most gratifying thing. That's why we do the work that we do.
So often this is all like really framed as in the culture wars, and a lot of people who are friendly at idea would really think that these people you're sympathizing with were really anti-religious. Is that the case, or was it something else?
No. That's a dead horse that.
Well, that's not a dead horse. People really think that's help them understand that they weren't religious.
I say it's a dead horse because it is so obviously not true, and there's some evidence it is not. First of all, nobody inquired when we stepped in as expert witnesses. Nobody inquired what the religious beliefs of the plaintiffs were before we agreed to help them. That was not what this was about. But I can tell you that the ones I know, of those plaintiffs, some of them are deeply religious, but that is a personal thing. That was, first of all, it's none of my business what their religious views are. What was my business was to help them protect the teaching of science in their school. But I can tell you that none of us ever asked, well, what are your religious views? How do you look at science? Before we agreed to help them. That was not what this was about. With some of the, at least, one of the scientists that you yourself interviewed, Kenneth Miller, is a very sincerely religious person. And, and he was one of the expert witnesses that helped them. So we didn't go into this being concerned about what people's personal religious commitments were. What we were trying to do was protect the teaching of science, which was under attack by other people who were using their religious commitments, imposing them on the process of educating children, and doing so in a way that would have completely corrupted their education. So, it's just, people who want to claim that if you support the teaching of evolution and you're against creationism, you're anti-religion. There's so much evidence against that. That's why I called it a dead horse.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about the trial, it just brings all these people who really disagree and experts across the spectrum really into a single place for a little while, right? Did you have any interactions with people from ID that you remember, or maybe even make a couple friends? Hopefully there was at least one positive interaction.
Well, that's where I first met William Dembski, was at my deposition.
Oh, tell me about that. Was that fun? Was he nice to you? Did you enjoy him?
Well, in Louisiana, you have to be nice to everybody. We believe in good manners down here. He was there at my deposition, which took about a day. He was not there the whole time. But, in Louisiana, we are nice. We are polite. I was raised to be a polite person. I had no reason to go in there and be anything other than my usual, Southern self, and put my hand out to shake hands with him and be cordial and pleasant. And what's interesting is that and that was the first and only time I ever met him in person. I even signed a copy of my book for him. But what was really interesting is that right before the trial, we had Hurricane Katrina happened right before the trial down here.
Oh wow, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and so I was stuck down here, and my testimony was delayed for a bit until I could get a flight out of here. But while I was down here preparing for the trial, I noticed that the Discovery Institute had put up a fake interview on their website. About me, an interview that I had never done, in which they referred to me in very, childish, juvenile way as Dr. Barking Forrest, and they were making fun of me. And then after the trial, Dembski was behind the posting on the internet of a cartoon making fun of Judge Jones.
Yeah, I remember that. That was pretty ugly.
An unpleasant body function that you could hear.
But did you reach out to the Discovery Institute about that fake interview? What did they do?
No, I mean, I thought it was ridiculous. I thought, is this, if they think this is going to help them in court, they've got another thing coming. That's not the type of, this type of juvenile, nasty, silly stuff is the kind of stuff that they did. And, it certainly does not betray any sincere concern for science on their part. In fact, it betrays just the opposite. If this is the kind of stuff they do, you can't see them as seriously having anything to offer to either the educational process or the scientific process. So that between other people I know who had interactions with them, we're always very cordial to them. But that doesn't mean that we were going to sit back and say nothing. And
I'm not suggesting that. No, we're just trying to get the
but I mean, that's, it's from a person. Oh, I did meet Professor Behe one time. And I was at Cold Spring Harbor at a conference there, and he was on the stairs, and I stopped, and he didn't know me. He had no idea who I was. And I stopped and introduced myself, and I was very cordial to him. So, from a personal standpoint, we have nothing against these people. If they were our next door neighbors, I'm sure I'd be willing to lend Professor Behe a cup of sugar, but they were not behaving in a way that, in a civic fashion, that was very cordial. And we had to answer what they were doing. Although from a personal standpoint, we have no animosity at all against these people.
Yeah. So here's another question that's a hard one. I want you to think about it. So, you've been studying this for a while, you actually, even if you haven't been acquainted with very many of them directly, you've been following them for a long time. Who do you think, who there do you think has been the most genuine and authentic, even if mistaken and wrong?
The most genuine and authentic.
and like well-intentioned, even if he's wrong, just or she's wrong, not correct, completely misguided, and maybe caught up on the wrong group, but really the most well-intentioned. And
I would probably have to say Professor Behe. I think he's a very sad case.
What do you mean?
I think he has, devoted his scientific professional life to a losing cause, to a misguided effort. And he could have, been, his own biology department put up a disclaimer against what he was doing. The Lehigh Department of Biology put up a disclaimer against his involvement with intelligent design. He still has a job to the extent that he teaches science appropriately in his classes. There's nothing wrong with that. I just think he's wasted his life in this effort. He could have been known for something other than this, but he chose this, and I don't know why. But I think to me, he's the saddest case because I think he's, I just think he did something that was very misguided. And but he had a choice. He could have gotten out. He didn't have to get in. Why he did is unknown to me. I just think that he's a sad case.
Well, there you have it. Thanks for talking to us this hour about the Dover trial and its impact and your role in it and kind of your thoughts on ID. It's an interesting moment, this milestone 15 years later. In a lot of ways, the textbook wars have really faded from view because of Dover, right? I mean, it's not really nearly as, it's still there. Occasionally we hear about it, but it isn't as much of a, well, it's never been anything that's been quite like Dover since then.
Well, now the area that we have to watch, including at NCSE, is climate change, climate science education.
Yeah, you guys alternate every year between evolution.
Yeah, and that's kind of a different kettle of fish, but it's just as much an attack on the teaching of science as creationism is, but it's sort of a different kettle of fish. So we still have to watch that. And of course, the religious right has not gone away, and the Discovery Institute is part of the religious right. And the promotion of intelligent design has been their logistical contribution to the effort of the religious right to control public education, especially science education. So that has not gone away, and it probably won't.
Yeah, so I think I think it is really a reshaped landscape since 15 years ago. It'll be interesting to see what happens from here, because you're right. I mean, I think ID has not gone away. I think there's still I think the culture wars are definitely changing, especially right now, especially when you talk to younger generations, but they're still there in the background. There's a reason why that framing is there in such a strong way. Even though, I'm pretty convinced that we could do better than the culture wars in our country. I mean, this is not the best way to be engaging with one another, but that's kind of where it's been for a long time. Anyhow, I think, like I said, thanks a lot for coming and being part of it. And if you like this conversation, leave a comment. Definitely consider just supporting us for $1 a month on Patreon. And thanks a lot for joining us today. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I'd like to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas. And I'm a non-believer, and I can still say Merry Christmas, everybody. And stay safe.
All right. Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Bye-bye.